Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. In Southeast Michigan, there are a few places where home construction is growing a little faster. The exurbs, including Lyon, Milford, and Commerce townships, recorded some of the highest housing permits last year. President of RE/MAX of Southeastern Michigan, Jeanette Schneider, joined the Metro to shed light on this new wave of construction. So why is home building so hot in places like Lyon, Commerce, and Milford?
I think there's probably a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, they have land. And if you're going to build, you have to go where there is available land. And the land that they have available tends to be vacant. So you're not having to rezone. You're not having to go back and undo, maybe something else that was there. So, I think that's the first thing is just availability. The other thing you do have to look at is you obviously have communities that are interested in doing this. They're interested in seeing development. They're working with developers. And so I think those two things combined right now in those areas are helping to spur that growth.
Now, you recently moved to Commerce. Tell us why you did that. What was appealing about that to you?
Well, in a word, a lake.
That's fair.
We had lived in Northville for 19 years. And before that, Novi, and before that, Livonia. So we've kind of been in that corridor for many years. And we have both, my husband and I, over the last few years, have lost our dads. And so now we have widowed moms that live in Saginaw and Frankenmuth. And we decided that, it doesn't look as though retirement is going to allow us to go someplace else. When that day comes, I'm not ready to do that yet. But if we're going to be staying in Michigan, then why don't we go where we really would enjoy life? And we got a boat during COVID, a small little boat. We wanted to be on a lake. And so we start taking a look. And that was, a big driving point. But that being said, the other driving point would be is we absolutely love the feel of the area. We absolutely love the mature trees, the walking trails, the nature. There's so many parks and recs and easy access to do outdoor activities, biking, walking, any of that. So that really spoke to us.
Have you found that since moving there, has it become a place where you feel you don't really need to leave? You don't really need to venture out? In other words, is the area feeling built up enough now to where it's got that community feel and you're like, oh, I don't need to go to Detroit to do this or that?
Yes and no. I would say, especially in the summer months, I think, it's easy to stay there because the bike trails, the walking trails, the lake are all kind of right there. So the outdoor activities are easily accessible. Obviously, they're still there in the winter, but you don't maybe do as many of those things. But as far as culture and restaurants, we have shopping. We have Meijer and Target, and, all of that is relatively close by. I'm spoiled. I'm used to downtowns. I lived in, Northville. So we had Northville, we had Plymouth. We were very close to Detroit. We do go to sporting events. And so in culture, just at the DSO for their holiday concert. So that we still do venture out for. But I really, as you asked the question, I wouldn't have thought about it that way. But I think it's more, we tend to venture out more in the winter and the spring months. In the summer, we stay a little closer to home.
It's seasonal. It's about what you can experience outside. That's fair. And speaking of Detroit, a lot of land has already been developed in and around the city. Why do you think we aren't seeing the construction of more apartments and townhomes closer to the city of Detroit?
I think in part, there's a variety of reasons for this, right? In part because most of the land is not vacant, so you already have something else there. So then that means you're repurposing an existing building. And, from a cost perspective, does it make sense for someone? It may not. So you've got that. Potentially, if you've got a building that's sitting there that was zoned for one purpose, and now you're going to have to go through the rezoning, and getting the community behind you on something like that. And then let's talk about that, because you're right. There is a tremendous housing shortage. It would be great if we had multi-unit housing to start to absorb some of that. But you'll hear that phrase, NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. Yep. It's great in practice. Oh, I don't want it near me. But it's great if it's over there. So I think to some degree, it's a multi-level challenge because you've got municipalities that, they have to be on board with doing this. The community really needs to support it. You need developers that can come in, and it financially has to make some sense for them as well. So it's really a multi-leveled challenge that needs to be solved by a variety of folks.
Sure, you need the developers who want to work with local officials
Yes.
and vice versa. What about inner ring suburbs like Hazel Park, Ferndale, Dearborn? If they want to keep growing, what kinds of recommendations would you have for them to try to develop more?
I mean, it's going to be the same thing. As I mean, a lot of these communities, like you said, Detroit itself, and then you kind of get to the inner ring. They're all highly developed. I mean, you don't see open space typically in these areas. They've already got buildings on them. So now, how do we get creative? There's certainly some commercial buildings that have some vacancies. Typically, I don't know if there'd be old hotels that can be converted into apartments, and things like that. I think there's the ability to get a little bit more creative, but it is going to take, probably some people in the planning departments at the local communities to, retake a look at what the master plan was, because it might have made sense 10 years ago, but things have changed. And how can that now be impacted to get, current with what the needs are?
And we'll remind listeners, a master plan essentially is the driving document that any local community, their leaders will make that, and that is what they're supposed to follow then when it comes to things like community character. How
Yes.
do I want my city or town to look? So in 2022, the state of Michigan produced a report to create or preserve 75,000 units across Michigan. It suggested rezoning when necessary to do that. In other words, they want to create more density, in part because that makes it easier to build. What do you think the state should be doing to achieve that goal?
Oh, I think realistically, we didn't get here by one party or a political party, one entity that's involved in this process. And I really think it needs to be a group effort. I applaud anybody in Lansing or at the federal level that wants to try to address this, but they themselves are not going to be able to handle this. I do think it involves, kind of getting all relative parties at the table, whether those are some blue ribbon committees, whether that's some other things like that. Let's get everybody that's involved in solving this talking to each other, because it's easy to put out a press release. This is what we want to do. And again, it has to start somewhere. I'm not knocking that, but that isn't going to be the only way to solve it. You need to get parties talking to one another about what does this mean. Yeah, you're saying we can do some rezoning, or we're going to put an effort towards it. Well, what does the effort mean? Does it mean reducing regulation? Does it mean giving subsidies? Does it mean tax credits? What does it mean to everybody else down the line to make this happen? And I think those are maybe conversations that need to be happening a little bit more.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Jeanette Schneider, president of RE/MAX of Southeastern Michigan. We're talking about where home construction is happening in Southeast Michigan. And right now, we're going to need federal dollars in order to build up. Whenever we've built large homes or homes in large numbers, it comes from support from the White House or Congress. Do you think that the Trump administration might do anything to build more around this country?
I'm certainly hoping so. I mean, I think there was signals during during his campaign. I said, I was surprised that, housing certainly was talked about, but I don't think nearly as much as I was expecting, given how important this is, to everybody. But I do think his administration understands there's a significant need for housing, and he is has some real estate experience at his core. I'd like to think that he and a team he could put together understands that. I know where his mind tends to go is deregulation, which is helpful. I mean, because that adds price to a home. It typically adds time it takes to get to home or homes, plural, built. But it is also going to require some government subsidies, grants, tax credits, a lot of different things that can happen in that regard. And I also know that he's got a group of people looking to cut waste. So how are those two going to manage each other, balance each other out? I guess, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. And the state, we were just talking about this creative ways. The state wants to build more multifamily units, things like duplexes, triplexes, because developers want to make more money. But people want single family homes. Do our preferences need to change as a culture, as a society, to build more in this state? Or do we have to be more okay with duplexes and triplexes in these really creative ways? Or, what are we looking at here?
No, I think you hit on something that's really interesting, because I would say that, yes, I mean, culturally, if you want to say this is, the American dream is to own your own home. And for many people, in their mind, that is what you just said. It is my home. It is a single family dwelling, and I've got a little green around me, my yard and, stuff like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you look at a lot of other, countries, they do build up more. There is multi-generational, in a house, there's multi-family units, like you said, duplex, triplex, things of that nature. And we do have bigger generations coming. Millennials are bigger than baby boomers. We've got, some bigger generations coming. The housing need isn't going to decrease anytime soon. And I think that maybe that is some things we need to start talking about a little bit, is what could homes look like? And especially maybe the entry level. There's nothing wrong with aspiring to have something, but, maybe if we can be a little more realistic on the front end of what that looks like.
I'm smiling right now because I'm like, yeah, some of us think, our first home, we need this giant, beautiful masterpiece of a home. And it's just like sometimes, maybe something small, just a little unit for yourself is okay, even if it is just a unit within other units and other spaces. So are you seeing a demand for aspiring homeowners for those smaller homes, or what are you seeing right now?
It is interesting, and I think some of this is price driven, is there has been a little bit of a trend, for not like the tiny homes, that we heard about, a number of years ago, but the footprint of a home overall getting a little bit smaller. And I think a lot of that has to do also with the cost to maintain a home, the cost to insure a home, everything else. I mean, if you can go a little smaller, not everybody needs a 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath. It's okay. I mean, I started out in a 900 and some square foot house. We did fine. But I think you're right. And, some of it is just every generation wants to do a little better than the generation before. And so, there were generations in the past that were perfectly fine starting out with a do-it-yourself, we'll fix it up, it doesn't have to be big. Over time, it's become, well, I have to have, like you said, I have to have the full-blown palace as my starter home. And no, there should be options out there.
Yes, thank you. And earlier this week, this is my last question to you. Earlier this week, we spoke with Thomas Segru, an expert on the creation and maintenance of Detroit's suburbs, and he had this to say about that.
Programs that began in the 1930s and 1940s set the expectations for what is risky or not risky, set the expectations for where people live or don't live, and basically harden the patterns of residential segregation by race that are still very deeply entrenched in the United States. It's been 100 years of federal housing policy, yet we can still see high rates of segregation in most of our major metropolitan areas, of course, including Detroit.
And whether people did it consciously or not consciously, the founding of the suburbs were exclusionary. So when we think about today and we see how folks are spreading out and we see how things are happening, are we still seeing that type of mentality, or are we just seeing people simply just moving away?
I don't disagree with what he said, and I don't know if it was conscious or subconscious. I think right now it's interesting because when the millennials started to become, homeowner age, there was a lot of anticipation and expectation that generation was going to be very urban based. They wanted to be in a walkable community. They wanted to be, they didn't want to have to drive. They wanted everything to kind of be very convenient. But what happened was they followed the same exact pattern that the generation before them had. Is I might start out there when I'm a young professional, and that's okay. But the minute I start to have kids, I'm moving on out, and they wanted the yard and all of that. And I think that, like you said, we've kind of talked about, I think perceptually that's what people envision when they say they own a home. And whether it's from, government, whether it's from, public policy, other things like that is, can we start to shift what people think about when they think about home ownership? This certainly isn't something that's going to change on a dime. But if it is something that as a country and as a community or as a state, we start to talk about a little bit more, let's talk about what housing. We understand that there's a need for housing. Here's how we can solve some of it, but it's going to look a little different than maybe the last X number, the last several decades have looked like.
That was Jeanette Schneider, the president of RE/MAX of Southeastern Michigan. She was speaking with us about where home construction is growing the fastest in Southeast Michigan. From the WDET Newsroom. Voters in the Ferndale School District will decide whether to approve a $114 million construction bond for improvements to its high school and middle school. Plans include larger classrooms and science labs, safer entries, and a new high school band room. Bond issues are also on the ballot today in the Lamphere, Mount Clemens, Redford Union, and Southgate school districts. In sports, the Tigers open a 3-game series against the Rockies. Colorado has the worst record in Major League Baseball. The Red Wings will have the 13th overall pick in this year's NHL draft. They moved down one spot in the draft lottery after finishing with the 12th worst record in the league this season. Coming up, yesterday, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel dropped all charges against 7 pro-Palestine protesters. We'll get some context about the cases from one of the defense attorneys. Stay with us here on the Metro. We'll be right back.